G'day, and welcome to Charlton, the friendly town on the Avoca River. Situated in the heart of the great state of Victoria, and over 200 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, this small town of just over 1,000 people holds plenty of treasures. And on this walk around Charlton on a lovely morning, we'll not only enjoy the serenity of a stroll alongside the Avoca River, but we'll also check out Traveller's Rest, a popular and historic caravan stop. We'll pass by the beautiful Rex Theatre and plenty of other landmarks on the wide open high street, and we'll get to know the story of where this town came from, as we admire historic churches, impressive memorials, and plenty more. All of that is to come over the next half hour, as we take a leisurely stroll around the heart of Charlton. But where better to begin our walk than by taking in a view of the beloved local pub, the East Charlton Hotel. One of the most recognisable spots on the town's immense high street, the East Charlton Hotel is also one of the oldest institutions in town. The pub began life over 160 years ago in 1863, when it was established by a Norwegian man named John Fluke, although at that time it was a much smaller and more rudimentary log and bark inn, set back from the main road by about 100 metres. It was rebuilt on a grander and more permanent scale in 1875, and then twice more, the current pub with its distinctive arches dating back to 1925, and having served many a happy customer in the 99 years since. But it's not only the convivial atmosphere which has contributed to the pub's longevity. It stands overlooking the high street, which is just one small part of a major route known as the Calder Highway, a more than 500-kilometre road which runs across the state of Victoria, from the city of Bendigo, near Melbourne, to the major inland town of Mildura, on the border with New South Wales. For decades then, people making the lengthy trip along the Calder Highway have needed a place to rest, and Charlton here has long been a favourite stop on the route. The historic Traveller's Rest Caravan Park, just here, today providing travellers with everything they need for a brief pit stop or an overnight halt. We'll take a look around the caravan park towards the end of our walk, but you might have noticed that it lies on John Curtin Drive, a road which is named after perhaps the most famous figure to have ever lived in Charlton, a former Prime Minister of Australia. John Curtin led the nation between 1941 and 1945, the bulk of the Second World War, but long before the war he came from humble beginnings in rural Victoria. Originally born further south in the town of Creswick, in 1894, at the age of 9, Curtin and his family moved to Charlton here, after his father took over the old Golden Fleece Hotel on the High Street, which stood just a couple of doors down from this point. For 3 years the Curtins lived at the pub, before moving away in 1896. But the PM's brief period in Charlton certainly hasn't been forgotten, and it's just the first of plenty of surprising stories to be discovered in this town. As we've already seen, Charlton's high street is lined by buildings of all shapes and sizes. There's a bakery and a branch of the Commonwealth Bank across the street, a local supermarket, an op shop, and a number of other locally run businesses. In the direction we're looking now, towards Bendigo and Melbourne, you'll also find a couple of motels on the edge of town. But in the heart of the high street here, there are few landmarks more storied than Charlton's post office, which has stood on the same site for pretty much as long as the town has existed, originally opened all the way back in 1871. Although it was heavily upgraded in the 1960s, the building that we're looking at here is the same one. But very sadly, just a couple of months after this video was filmed in September of 2023, Charlton's storied post office was destroyed by a fire in November 2023. The loss of this fetching piece of local heritage is a reminder that many of the historic buildings on Charlton's high street, which thousands of people drive past every day, won't be around forever, and so many are well worth lending a moment to observe if you have the chance. But before we turn our attention to the next historic landmark on the main road, it's also worth knowing how the town of Charlton got started in the first place. Situated in a region of Victoria traditionally owned by the native Jara people, The history of the modern town of Charlton can be traced back to the first half of the 19th century, just a few years before the beginning of the Victorian gold rush. Now, unlike many other towns along the Calder Highway here, Charlton doesn't actually owe its existence to gold. Development here came a few years later, as former gold miners turned their hand to agriculture. As we know, Charlton is situated hundreds of kilometres away from the nearest major urban areas. Bendigo over 100 km to the southeast, and Mildura more than 300 to the northwest. But while these mind-boggling distances may indeed be immense, it means that this town is surrounded by sparsely populated lands which are rich in fertile soil, and this affords local farmers plenty of space to go about their business. Unsurprisingly, agriculture, and grain production in particular, is and has long been the leading source of income in the local area. But not everybody in Charlton has made a living here from farming. Just here we're looking at a building which was once upon a time the Globe Hotel, another local pub, which began life back in 1874. Sadly, the Globe closed long ago in 1971, but it was one of a number of institutions which were set up on the High Street to cater to the growing population in the late 19th century, the growth of agriculture at the time only spurring the wider development of this town. After sporadic settlement in the preceding decades, it was in the 1870s when the growth of the town really accelerated, giving birth to many of the landmarks that we know today. Although just across the road here is a slightly newer spot on the High Street. The utterly gorgeous Rex Theatre might just be the most beautiful building on Charlton's main road. It's an eye-catching Art Deco landmark that was built back in 1938, and which is just as magnificent inside, home to an auditorium with room for more than 350 people, about a third of the entire town. Today the Rex functions as an entirely volunteer-operated establishment, bringing live performances and the latest blockbusters from around the world to this corner of Victoria. The theatre is neighboured by the town's main supermarket, which stands on the site of the old Golden Fleece Hotel, once upon a time run by the Curtin family back in the 1890s. Closed not long after in 1914, the tavern was converted into a row of buildings which now mark the northwestern end of the High Street. At this point, the road makes its way across the Avoca River, and we'll do just that as well in a few minutes' time, but not before we admire this splendid mural welcoming travellers to Charlton. As you can see, it features a number of local landmarks, and plenty of illustrations of sheep and grain to portray the town's agricultural character. As we're exploring the High Street, the vast expanse of agricultural lands surrounding Charlton's town centre isn't immediately apparent, but the town is small enough that you can quickly find yourself in the depths of the countryside, within a 15-minute walk from the High Street, with plenty of natural landmarks to be discovered on the town's outskirts. We won't quite have time to venture out into the countryside, but here at the end of the High Street we find Charlton's prominent War Memorial. It was unveiled back in 1923 to commemorate the local men who lost their lives fighting in the First World War, and it was later adjusted to also include the names of those from Charlton who fell during the Second World War. In all, 60 names are engraved on the memorial, the loss of so many men in a small community meaning that few people were untouched by the effects of the World Wars. But this wasn't the first time that Charlton had been impacted by conflict. The modern town of Charlton emerged during the late 19th century, when Victoria was a colony of the British Empire, and as such many of those who'd settled here still fought in Britain's wars overseas. Just inside a small garden at the end of the High Street, for instance, there stands a small obelisk, which is dedicated to the people from Charlton who fell during the Second Boer War, fought in modern-day South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. These gardens are home to a number of other monuments too, including a Vietnam War Memorial and a Roll of Honour. But not all are dedicated to wars of the past. This large Rotunda bandstand, for instance, was opened back in 1926 in tribute to a local solicitor named Benjamin Green, who was also, rather impressively, a 3-time champion at the Old Victorian Lawn Tennis Championships, once played at the mighty MCG in Melbourne. And Green's Rotunda stands just outside one of Charlton's oldest buildings, the former Mechanics' Institute, which was built back in 1882. Once upon a time, this was the home of the local library, and a meeting space for community organisations, and later it served as the offices of the Shire of Charlton local authority. But since 1973, it's been the home of the Golden Grains Museum, Charlton's delightful local museum. Taking its name from the golden-coloured grains farmed in the fields around town, the museum here is home to a wide collection of local artefacts, not only from Charlton proper, but the rest of what was once upon a time the Shire of Charlton, including everything from historic agricultural tools to day-to-day items, and plenty of photos from yesteryear. Open every week on Sundays, this is the place to come to learn all you need to know about Charlton's proud history, just a tiny bit of which we'll be able to cover on our walk around the town today. As we mentioned earlier, there's much more to Charlton's history than what we can see around the town today. The native Jara people are the traditional owners of the land, and they lived widely across the area around the Avoca and Loddon rivers in what is now central Victoria. Once upon a time, it's believed that a semi-permanent Aboriginal camp existed in the hills just to the west of where Charlton is today, and it was known in the local language as Yoanduk, meaning something like rock basin, referring to the basins of water to be found in the landscape. We'll pick up the story of Charlton before the era of European settlement in a moment, but just here, at the top of Halliday Street, we find the town's fetching fire station, which was built in 1931. The fire station stands at one end of yet another row of historic landmarks, in the middle of which is Charlton's unassuming but fascinating old Wesleyan chapel. It was built right at the beginning of the town's development, in 1876. But the problem with being opened so early in the town's history was that it wasn't prepared for how many people would eventually move to Charlton. In fact, the local congregation quickly outgrew this humble chapel. So in 1885, the congregation moved out, and this chapel was converted into a Sunday school. In recent decades, however, this historic chapel fell out of use almost entirely, but it was eventually restored and reopened in 2023, coincidentally on the very same November day that the post office burned down on the High Street. Just next door to the revitalised Wesleyan chapel, there stands the much larger Uniting Church, which was opened in its current form in 1963, today still regularly hosting religious services as one of 3 churches to be found on Charlton's streets. Now, churches were among the first buildings constructed on the streets surrounding Charlton's main road, places of quieter reflection away from the hustle and bustle of the town centre, which was becoming ever busier with people as the 19th century drew to a close. But as we were just discussing, Charlton's history began with the native Jara tribe, who knew this area as Yoanduk. A lack of written history means that little in general is known about this place before the 19th century, but it's thought that around 1,000 people of the tribe were living in this area in the years immediately before the first Europeans arrived. We mentioned earlier that the first European settlers in Charlton arrived in the 1840s. They were 2 squatters by the names of Robert Kay and William Kay. Together they established a station, a large farmstead, which they named Charlton, most likely after what was then the small village of Charlton in Greenwich in the southeast of England. In the early years, European settlers even employed Jara people as labourers on their farms and in their homes, with a few hundred Aboriginal people continuing to live in Charlton throughout the mid-19th century. The original station had begun life on the western side of the Avoca River, but over time a civilian town grew up on the eastern side just here. Initially, this was a bit of an issue, because the Avoca River served as the boundary between 2 larger districts of Victoria, and so the settlements here existed as 2 separate stations, West Charlton across the river and East Charlton here. As it is today, East Charlton was the main centre of activity, but as more and more people moved into the area, it soon spread to both sides of the river, meaning that the name East Charlton was no longer accurate, paving the way for this town to eventually be known simply as Charlton. Just here we can see the Shire of Charlton on a board, one of the many memorials in these small gardens, which are officially known as the Elliott Gardens, after this man. This bust depicts Major General H.E. Pompey Elliott, who was born in West Charlton in 1878. Throughout his childhood, he grew up here in poverty, but his fortunes changed in 1894, when the family moved to the city of Ballarat after his father discovered gold in the ground there. Elliott went on to serve in the military during the Boer War and the First World War, later returning to Australia and serving as a senator for Victoria in the Australian Parliament in Melbourne in the years before it moved to Canberra. Speaking of famous local figures, a man named James Paterson lends his name to the main road bridge in Charlton, which spans the Avoca River. Paterson, originally from the town of Wedderburn to the southeast of Charlton, was contracted to construct a bridge across the Avoca in 1867, a time when it was unusually easy to build a bridge here. For years in the late 1860s, Charlton and much of the surrounding area was hit by a severe drought, so severe in fact that there was no water flowing in the river through town for 3 years until 1870. As we can see, things are much different today. In fact, the Avoca River is more prone to flooding in Charlton than drying up entirely. And while James Paterson's original wooden bridge did survive the eventual arrival of the current, it couldn't withstand the growing frequency of traffic crossing the river at this point. As ever more heavy coaches, goods vehicles and more began to trundle along the Calder Highway, the old wooden bridge in Charlton was simply too weak to cope. And so in the 1920s, it was decided that a much larger and stronger concrete bridge would be built here. And that is the bridge which still stands today, and which we're crossing now. The river which the bridge spans, the Avoca, is not only a beautifully picturesque feature, which winds its way through the heart of town, but as we mentioned earlier, it once formed the border between East and West Charlton. Having crossed the bridge, we now find ourselves in what was once upon a time West Charlton, which in the town's early days was typically the poorer side of the river. Things have changed over time though. Not only is this side of the Avoca home to a wealth of farmland, but it's also where you'll find the historic Vale of Avoca pub, the railway line through town, and Charlton's main sporting facilities, including the famous Charlton Racecourse, a venue for harness racing. In recent years, West Charlton has even established itself as one of the most desirable parts of town to live, in no small part due to the fact that the land on this side of the river is ever so slightly higher than it is in East Charlton. It may not seem like an important feature, but the Avoca River, as beautiful as it may be, has also long been known for bursting its banks and flooding the town in heavy rain. In fact, Charlton has fallen victim to devastating floods on numerous occasions. 1909, 1939, 1956, 1983, 1988, 1995, 2010, 2011 and 2016 among the worst of countless inundations through time. Considerations have been made towards building new flood defences in town, but for the moment the threat of flooding remains a major risk in Charlton. Still, on pleasant dry days like today, the riverside is a wonderful part of town to explore. A nature trail, which follows the river's path, always offers the chance to see a wealth of bird species in the trees, and if you're lucky, you might even spot a bunny rabbit or two hopping about, while kangaroos, wallabies and lizards are rare, but not entirely unheard of. As well as local wildlife, there are plenty more points of interest. This fetching wood carving, just beside the town's playground and swimming pool, is a real delight. While if you follow the river trail, between the distinctive red and yellow gum trees to the edge of town, you'll also stumble across Charlton Weir, a pleasant spot for birdwatching, or simply enjoying the calming soundtrack of the river's flow. As we've seen so far on this walk, Charlton is a quiet town, especially away from the main road. and that makes it the perfect place to stop if you're travelling along the Calder Highway, with plentiful and easily accessible nature providing an ideal outlet if you've spent a few hours in the car. We mentioned earlier that Charlton has long been a favoured stopping point for travellers, and today it's home to Traveller's Rest, one of the Calder Highway's best caravan stops, which is located back on the other side of the Avoca. Happily, there's another bridge at this point of the river, and it's probably one of the most scenic spots in the whole town. This beautiful river crossing is the Charlton Swing Bridge, which was opened back in 2006 to link the caravan park to the Riverside Nature Trail. It's one of a long line of bridges that cross the Avoca River. In fact, the waterway which flows through Charlton is one of Victoria's longest rivers, flowing across the state from south to north for 270 kilometres, making it longer even than the mighty Yarra River, which flows through the centre of Melbourne. The river's source is located about 100 kilometres south of here, near the town of Avoca, and both the river and town take their name from the River Avoca and the village of Avoca in County Wicklow, located in the southeast of Ireland, and they were so named by the Scottish surveyor Major Thomas Mitchell, who charted much of central Victoria in the 1830s and who had known the Irish River earlier in his life. Lined by grand gum trees on both banks, it's difficult to imagine that this river looks much like the one in Ireland. But outside the town centre here, the Avoca River is also good for fishing. Murray cod, golden perch, spiny crayfish and plenty more found swimming in its waters. But ultimately, there are few things better to do in Charlton than to stroll along the Avoca on a sunny morning like this. And the swing bridge brings us back over the river into East Charlton, where we find the modern-day caravan park known as Traveller's Rest. As we mentioned earlier, Charlton is a favoured stopping point on the Calder Highway, located around halfway between Melbourne and Mildura. If you're looking to split the journey up into a couple of days then, Charlton's Traveller's Rest has everything you need, with a barbecue and shelter where you can relax by the river, as well as a playground, a camp kitchen, and plenty more things to do. If you're parking your caravan here overnight, there's a range of options, from simple patches of grass to sites with electrical power, and even a couple of en-suites with a bathroom for private use. Do of course check and book ahead with the caravan park if you're thinking of stopping here, but it's certainly a great idea, because it'll give you the chance to explore the rest of this wonderful town. But even if you don't go for a stroll around Charlton, Traveller's Rest itself is surprisingly busy with history and points of interest. For instance, the caravan park occupies part of the land where the original log and bark East Charlton Hotel stood back in the 1860s. But as it was soon rebuilt directly on the main road, the land here gained a different use, as the venue of the historic Charlton Sale Yards, an open space where farmers and businessmen associated with the local agricultural stations would sell their produce, with bustling cattle markets, fresh produce and more all spreading out across the area where people now park their caravans. But in a small shed just beside the caravan park is an often overlooked reminder of this spot's agricultural heritage. Behind the grate are two pieces of historic machinery, a combine harvester and a winnower, the latter used to separate chaff from grain. Both of these machines were manufactured more than 100 years ago, at some point between 1890 and 1920, and they were built at the Charlton Foundry, which once stood on the High Street, roughly where the town's modern Foundry Palms Motel is today. Now, Charlton's old foundry, established all the way back in 1885, was a bit of a star back in the day. It produced a wide range of wagons, agricultural machinery, and more to a very high standard. So much so that many of their products were in great demand, not just locally, but all over Australia. The foundry remained in operation for decades, until it eventually closed in 1964. But its legacy is one of a number of interesting stories you can discover simply by strolling around Charlton's caravan park. For instance, in the shadow of a fetching steel windmill is one of the loveliest viewing points over a bend in the Avoca River. But if you look back over to the other bank, you'll notice a big swordfish, one of Charlton's more unusual landmarks. But there are no swordfish swimming in the Avoca, and the monument in fact represents a Kenyan broad-bill swordfish. The reason? The swordfish was one of 72 big aquatic creatures that were sculpted for the opening ceremony of the 2006 Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, one representing each country participating. And after the Games, these big fish statues were distributed to regional locations all around Victoria, as part of an effort to boost tourism. On a slightly less quirky note, meanwhile, beside this viewing platform, we also find a sign which shows us a list of the Avoca's biggest floods through Charlton's history, reaching flood heights of up to 8.7 metres, as was the case in 2011. If we were standing here then, we would have been up to our waist in water. In fact, 80% of Charlton was left underwater in those devastating floods, and as many as 300 homes were severely affected by the inundations. Fortunately, the town has recovered since that severe flood, and here in the beautifully manicured Traveller's Rest, we can enjoy delightful landmarks like this old windmill, donated to the town in memory of one Arthur Faulkner Linus, a lance corporal who was awarded a military cross for bravery back in 1918, and who in later years resided here in Charlton. Now, traditionally, this kind of windmill, known as a wind pump, is used on farms to pump water around the fields, serving as part of the wider irrigation system. Just like the old Winnower and the combine harvester, as well as the wealth of material inside the Golden Grains Museum, you'll see plenty of agricultural machinery, old and new, on display around Charlton. But while we know that people began moving here to farm the fields in the 19th century, the question remains, where were they selling their produce to? Well, while Charlton may have started out as a pair of remote farming stations, it soon found itself incorporated into the ever-growing trade network, which was spreading out across Victoria in the late 19th century. Roads linking Charlton to Bendigo were the first part of this, but in the 1880s the railways arrived, as a branch line was built between the town of Corong Vale, about 35 kilometres to the east, and Wycheproof, just over 20 kilometres to the northwest. These trains passed through Charlton, picking up grain from the town's farms, as well as some passengers. Today the line remains in use by freight trains, but few stop in Charlton. The town's old railway station, which was located just to the northeast of Traveller's Rest, has been left unused for decades, although its old platform still remains largely intact. So with no trains stopping, the only way to reach Charlton today, other than by car, is by bus. The town's bus stop is just here at the entrance to Traveller's Rest, and it lies on the route between Bendigo Station and Sea Lake, near to the world-famous Lake Tyrrell. If you're one of the many tourists venturing up to Lake Tyrrell, then it's well worth stopping here in Charlton. But as we now find ourselves back on the High Street, we've long been referring to Charlton as a place simply to make a brief stop as part of a longer journey. Plenty of people do this, and it's part of the reason that this town grew up over the years. But the fact is that Charlton and the surrounding area have plenty more to offer, should you wish to stay in town for a longer period. Beyond the highlights that we've seen in the town centre, Charlton sits close to a beautiful silo art trail, featuring huge grain silos decorated with dazzling murals, and they can be seen all over the mostly flat surrounding countryside. But the land isn't entirely flat around here. We mentioned earlier that the Jarrah people lived in a group of low-lying hills just to the west of Charlton, and about an hour's walk from the town centre you'll find these hills, the most prominent being the prominent Clunders Hill, also known as Mount Duberbetic, which offers some stunning views over the town and the rest of the region if you climb up to the top. Rather more rustic sights are on offer if you make your way off the High Street and take a stroll around the mostly residential streets which surround it. Here we find ourselves on Armstrong Street, part of the road south towards the larger town of St Arnaud, and it's home to another of Charlton's churches. This is St Martin's, the town's Anglican church, which was originally founded in 1889. All the way back then, it looked nothing like it does today. The current church, built in the 1960s, replaced a much smaller, weatherboard church that was built in the town's infancy. That speaks volumes about the eclectic range of buildings which you'll find on Charlton's side streets. Historic roads like nearby Watson Street, Camp Street and more host houses built at various different stages of history, from between the late 19th century right up to the modern day. Here, for instance, is another rather newer building, the Charlton Shire Hall, which is one of the town's main venues for local events, performances and parties. The hall is neighboured by the town's RSL sub-branch, a venue for people who are serving or have served in the Australian Defence Force. As we've learned, plenty of men in Charlton have achieved distinguished military careers, but just here we find a mural dedicated to the women of World War II, many of whom took up the crucial role of agricultural jobs that were vacated by men serving overseas, and they helped to keep Australia fed right throughout the conflict. On top of that, many volunteered on the home front. The woman with a pair of binoculars in this mural represents one of the many women who formed part of the Volunteer Air Observation Corps, watching the skies over Australia for any enemy aircraft. And the Corps had a post right here in Charlton, at Gordon Park, just on the other side of the river. But having made our way back and forth across the river, and having stumbled upon a wealth of riveting landmarks and stories all over the town centre, it's here that our walk around Charlton has sadly reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own visit to Charlton sometime soon.